Okay, so our Retina 3C, small c. This one, the next task here is just to strip down the body and service it in the way I normally would. At the moment, apparently, it's a very good working example of the camera. But I want a new home for this camera, and so I need to send the camera out in the best possible state. And that means I need to deal with things like dried up sticky old grease that might be in the film advance mechanism or in the focus mechanism, or odd loose screws or other minor problems which don't immediately appear to be a problem but very likely will be. So be into it. I'll start at the top, open the back of the camera. Someone was puzzled as to how you open the back of one of these cameras. This little thing here is a cover. It's spring loaded. You can push that across with your finger and it exposes the button. Press the button and it releases the back catch. So no great secrets there once you know. Right, so the rewind first, I think. Put something through the fork of the rewind, spin it off with my fingers, pop those pieces to one side. The meter dial here, that needs to come off. Now the meter, I checked the meter on this. The meter was quite good. It was incorrectly set, so it wasn't accurate, but it did respond proportionally across the range. So once I'd set my film speed scale correctly, which was about 1.5 stops from where it had previously been sitting, everything appeared quite good. Anyway, out with this little screw. Pop those to one side. The top cover, one screw at this end, two here at the rewind. They are chrome plated brass, easily damaged. Take care not to do so. Hold my finger on the meter so that it doesn't lift up with the top cover, and take the top cover off. The meter, the single screw here, it originally went through a loop on the meter. That loop's history. That's broken away there on the other side now. You can tell by the shape of that that's been damaged with solvent, I would think. Doesn't matter, we don't need that. Take that off. The shutter release button can come off. The film release button can come off. The springs, they won't be going through the ultrasonic cleaner, they can come off and be put separately. The rangefinder. Well, the rangefinder of course has all been carefully cleaned and adjusted. Now it will no longer be adjusted, because as soon as you disturb the mount you can just about kiss goodbye to your adjustments. Have that and recover the two screws from it. The rangefinder I'm not going to have to service because I've done it. Strap lug at this end of the body. The earliest 3Cs had polished body edges. Latter 3Cs like this one have a chrome trim plate. Remove the two screws at this end. Just checking there's no washers under there. Sometimes you might find a shim washer underneath that, in which case it's quite likely it needs to go back. Take off our chrome trim plate. It's a bit dirty but nothing dramatic. The film rewind here, we can have that off, 2 screws. Sometimes those screws are loose, not so common with this model as the later 3 Big C cameras, which I think was probably down to the fact that they used an alloy, an aluminium alloy for that piece instead of the brass, and just thermal cycling probably loosened things like that up. Out here, what can we do next? Let's take this bracket off, clamp bracket that holds down the shutter cocking rack, and I've got a special screwdriver for taking that little post off. It's just a screwdriver that's been bored down through the middle to clear the post, and a slot cut across the end to engage the flats on that post, and that post is actually loose. So that means that most likely someone had had it off in the past and hasn't tightened it again, possibly because they didn't have the tool. Cocking rack, out with that. I'm just going to hold that up to the window and see what the teeth look like. That generally looks pretty good. I don't think we'll have a problem with that. It was certainly working fine. Okay, so what here? Now, I'll take the door off so that I can show you the shutter release and the components there. Now that hinge pin is slightly loose. It's not a great surprise. The one at the bottom of the camera was actually missing. Now here I'm holding my hand carefully over that shutter release so it doesn't get away. And here we can access this screw through the leatherette because the original screw had worked its way out through the leatherette. Right, so we swing the door forward. See, there's a spacer washer on the top there at that hinge point. There's not one at the bottom. I'd be surprised if there had been, because of course that's where the screw had come out and it would have had a chance to get away. See, the grease is a bit dirty and discoloured there. It doesn't appear to have picked up a great deal of grit. So the shutter release, what are we looking at here? Okay, well here's the shutter release shaft, this piece. Let's see if I can zoom you in a bit. Okay, so here's our shutter release shaft. That travels right through here. It travels through the guide at this point, through this sleeve at this point, through that spring at that point, and through the guide at the bottom. Now what happens is if you let this shaft come out while you're working on the camera, very likely that spring is going to jump out. See if I can get this back in without disturbing anything. What tends to happen is if you allow the shutter release shaft to come out, nothing is holding that spring in position anymore. And what happens is it tends to pop out. And what it does is it drops down into the space between the shroud, the black piece here, and the body. It gets down by the bellows. And what happens there is that it then gets crunched up when you try and close the front of the camera. And you can never get the damn thing out without dismantling the camera typically. Anyway, out with the shutter release. That's a bit greasy and sticky. The other thing that happens if you are playing with your camera and the shutter release is out is that this sleeve here is also very good at becoming dislodged, and that will tend to fall down somewhere useful. Again, it's likely to end up there. It's just busy trying to fall down there now. It'll end up likely to end up down in that gap down in there between the bellows and the shroud. And again, you're going to have to take the whole camera apart to get it to bits. Right, so with that part done, and it's sitting in a perilous state, fortunately I'm taking the camera entirely to pieces, so I'm going to be in that deep anyway. But if you were just going in to adjust the rangefinder or something of that nature, and you were careless, and you let that shutter release shaft get away, you could be in for all this work as well. So, out with the shutter. Check that I've got the shims with that. I'll put its retaining ring back on there. And the shutter, of course, has been fully serviced, so I can put that to one side. Back to the camera body. You can continue with the film advance mechanism, taking that apart. I'll start on the bottom. Let's get the leatherette off, patch off the film advance lever. That appears to be fairly well stuck. I'm going to need a new scalpel blade on that one. This one's chipped, it's not helping me. Let's see how this goes now. That patch is very well stuck down. And the leatherette looks a little bit brittle to me. Okay, I'm further under it now. It means my scalpel blade is coming in at a flatter angle, and I'm not bending up the leatherette to the same extent. Right, I'm going to put a drop of naphtha under there to lubricate that surface. It's not going to melt the adhesive, but it'll make the scalpel slide under there a little bit easier. Yeah, it's off. That'll go back, no problem at all. I'm just looking at the state of that. I'm not seeing any other adhesive other than what originally would have been on there. Let's get the rewind back catch cover off. 2 small screws. They are chrome brass, I think. Very easily damaged. So take care to get those off. Now there's the return spring here. I'll put that with my springs. These 2 pieces won't go through the ultrasonic cleaner, because the ammonia based detergent I use isn't kind to aluminium for one thing, and I don't want to strip out the black paint from the little arrowhead mark on there, so they'll get put to one side. Back to the body. 3 screws holding on the film advance lever. Sometimes they're loose, sometimes they're tight. These ones are neither, they're just right. Here's our film advance lever. It's got a little patch on here, a little rubber patch, a buffer. That's important that that's there, and if it's not there you need to replace it with another piece of rubber. Don't use a rubber band, they're no good, that tends to perish and cause you grief. Okay, so this leatherette, we need this off, so I've got to get my scalpel underneath here. With luck this will come off well. There's a difference between the way it'll stick in the middle here and the way it'll stick around the outside, because around the outside it's sitting on chromed brass, and around the middle it's sitting against the aluminium casting, and the adhesive will react differently depending on the substrate. Presumably some chemical difference there does that. Now of course we've got a little hole in it here where the screw had punched through. So I'll be a bit careful here with the scalpel. I don't want to cut through the leatherette. You know, occasionally that happens. That's just part of life. But you try and avoid it as much as possible. There are virtually no new leatherettes, replacement leatherettes about. There are a few. I don't think I've got a full set. And often replacement leatherettes, the old ones, new old stock, have shrunken over time, and as a result they don't fit well. So it's always worth taking all the time you need to get your leatherettes off in one piece. Now this leatherette's got some sort of odd bump there, and I suspect it's just a Zeiss bump over a screw head. We'll find out. And here I'm sliding the scalpel down between the leatherette and the metal surface, and I'm more prying the leatherette up than I am cutting anything, so that the blade is acting as a wedge. Sometimes it's quite tough to get around the boss here in the middle, and be careful around that boss because that's anodised aluminium. It scratches fairly easily, and if you're poking and prodding at it with a tool like this, you'll scratch that black off, in which case you're going to have to get a marker pen and disguise that at a later date. Here I'm just busy trying to work my way back to that boss so that the leatherette will lift off easily. Alright, I'm going to work in from the end now. It's a very, very thin piece of leatherette, around that button, of course, so that's quite commonly breaks at that point. Don't lose too much sleep over that. Once it's all glued down, no one will ever know but you. Yeah, it's a bit difficult getting under that corner. See if it's sticky. I'll just put a drop of naphtha down there again, just to make it easier for the scalpel blade to slide. It's stuck quite well just at that point. When these cameras were comparatively modern, spare parts were readily available and no great time was taken in the service department getting leatherettes off, because you just got another one from the spare parts bin and put the camera together with that. Okay, so there's our leatherette off. You can see a blob of green there. That was the Zeiss bump that we could see coming up from that screw head there. Let's pop that to one side. And here's the base plate. So this is chrome plated brass. We'll take the screws off that. The screws are just nickel plated. That one's playing hard to get. The slot is a bit shallow on that screw. Here's our Zeiss bump specialist. Okay, so we've got our screws off there. The chrome trim plate will come off. It's a bit grimy, but nothing too bad. That'll clean up well. Now we can see the film advance components at the bottom here. And the tripod socket. The tripod socket, very often the screws are loose on that. And they are in this case. Or one of them was anyway. Only one of the three were loose. What tends to happen if the screws are loose is that when you go to put your camera on the tripod, it doesn't seem quite firm. And so people tend to tighten up the tripod screw a little bit more. And it still seems to rattle. So they tighten up the screw a little bit more. And of course, before you know it, they've stretched the screws, gone halfway to stripping the threads out of the body, and the tripod still doesn't tighten up. Okay, so anyway, we've got our tripod socket out. Let's have a go at this film advance. This here is the film release lever, and basically that locks the film advance in place when you reach the end of the film, frame number 1. I'm just going to remove that little C clip or E clip and pop that to one side and drop that lever out of the base of the camera. That can go in for cleaning. This one with the screw on the top is connected to this shaft here, which is the release. Now that release, the other one was the lock lever, this is the release lever, and the release lever's job is to release the film advance mechanism to allow you to wind on to the next shot when you press the shutter release. And that shaft has a little spring on the bottom, and the job of that spring is to keep this lever in firm contact with the cam. And that spring is fairly delicate and easily lost, so I take that off carefully and put it to one side so it doesn't go through the cleaner. At the top here, in the centre, that screw there, you can see it's got a couple of just 2 spots to connect to, and I've got a screwdriver suitably butchered to do that job. So we can, if I hold that thing from turning, we're in the picture, we are just, oh, that screw is tight. Let me pop my lock lever back in there. Which will lock that shaft for me. Then I can undo that screw. Back at it with the lock lever. So screw out little gear on the top. There's the screw. Got a washer. We've got this little drive dog arrangement here, which reminds me I owe somebody one of those, and I'll have to get onto that shortly. This is the piece that couples to, and here's the spring that pushes that coupling plate upwards, and here is the gear on the top, which is driven. In here we have 2 screws. This one, an extended one, a shoulder screw. The top of this screw supports the cocking rack. If that screw's loose, then the cocking rack will be loose. It won't be held firmly in contact with the gear, and there's a great likelihood that as a result it'll come to grief. This screw has a spring on the top which acts against a pawl. I've just taken that screw out and taken the spring off it. That acts against this pawl, which stops the film advance from backing up. And it was a spacer that sat underneath it. The rewind button needs to come off, and I've got a special pair of pliers for doing that. These are my pliers. You can see they've just got a hole bored in the end of them for all practical purposes to match this button. And that allows me to get onto that button without doing any damage to it. So it's got a washer and a spring, and there's the chromed button. The sprocket shaft here is coupled to the sprocket with a screw that runs into a slot here. So I could expose that. Remove that screw. Just starting to get a bit buried in here with tools I don't need to use at the moment. Pop that shaft up. Here's our sprocket shaft. Here's the film sprocket, which doesn't go through the ultrasonic cleaner. And this should come off the top. This is the bush for the top of the film advance shaft and has a little gear on it. This is the clutch assembly. That allows some degree of slippage between the sprocket and the take-up spool to allow for the increasing diameter of the effective take-up spool as the film builds up on it. If you didn't allow for any slippage there, you'd end up tearing out sprockets. The sprocket holes. Okay, so here, this is the rewind button catch. I'm just going to unhook the spring so it's not under tension and doesn't fly across the workshop as soon as I look at it. It's a shoulder screw, 2 shoulders on the screw, one for the lever and one for the spring. Take that spring out, put that to one side, take out our lock lever. There are 3 screws accessible through these holes here that hold the plate that holds that in position. Sometimes they're loose and that can cause you problems. I think this screwdriver is a bit blunt, perhaps. It's not seating particularly well for me. I think we're done. That's our shaft out. Now there were 3 screws that held this plate, and that plate, of course, those screws were accessed through those 3 holes there. Those 3 screws are the same size as the ones that held that chrome trim plate on the base. We take out our film take-up spool, a brass bush there can come out, and the plastic spool doesn't go through the cleaner. Starting to look a bit stripped down here now. So, what's next? Okay, so getting this apart is entertaining because we've got to mark stuff so everything goes back in the correct position. This piece, this chrome shroud, can come off. That holds the transfer shaft, or the front part of the transfer shaft, firmly in position. They're chromed brass, those screws. As always, fairly delicate, easily scratched. Try not to do it. So there's the front part of our transfer shaft. We can lift that straight out. Here we've got our focus mechanism. This screw at the top moves backwards and forwards because it's coupled to this piece on the focus helical. That needs to come out, that post. That screw post is what couples to our rangefinder. Two small screws here hold this plate onto the front of the inner helical. Just swapping out a screwdriver here for a better one. And that should come out now with a bit of wriggling. This is the arm that couples to the rangefinder. You can see it's hinged to allow it to fold back out of the way. Here we've got the inner and outer helical and the focus scale ring. You need to know where this goes back so you can put it back in the same place. So normally what I do is I adjust them until the inner and outer helical are sitting at the same level, and I can do that by getting the end of a rule across there and seeing where it makes contact, and actually it's right down hard there. Basically that looks good, and then I'm going to put scribe marks across it. Now often there are already scribe marks there from other people's attempts, and I can see two scribe marks here lining up with two marks there, which presumably, no, it's not at the infinity position or anything else. So somebody's had to shut the film focus mechanism apart, put it back in somewhere different. It's okay. So normally what I do is I just run two scribe lines across the base. Like that. So now I can tell where the focus scale ring was lined up to the outer helical and where that lined up to the inner helical. And normally I'll put just one scribe line across the other side to do the same job. And between the two lines I can tell where stuff came from. So 4 screws. If you needed to make a change, an adjustment to the focus of your camera, which would be quite unusual, but possibly if somebody had lost one of the shims from behind the shutter, or if you'd moved the shutter and lens assembly from another camera into this one, you might need to move the position of the focus scale ring relative to the outer helical in order to make an adjustment. Okay, so far so good. 4 screws here hold the retaining ring in place. That screw's busy trying to get away. We lift that off. Here we've got 8 screws left. These nickel plated ones hold the focus scale the whole focus mount onto the front standard. The black ones hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. We'll remove the black ones. It's the black ones loose. Take the nickel plated ones out. Lift that whole assembly out. Right, I'll just recover those screws. Make sure I've got 4 of each. We can lift out the inner and outer helical. They should just slide out. And here's the inner and outer helical together. They can unscrew. I've got my alignment marks so I know where stuff will go back together. They'll be going through the ultrasonic cleaner. Our shroud assembly here, this whole business, needs to come out. 2 screws at the top here, flathead screws. They're usually tight, and there's no exception this time. Now they run, in this case they run into little bushes on the inside of the shroud, and the bush has just pushed through and is now rotating loosely, so one of the screws didn't want to come out. Just means the bush is rotating on the inside. That's not uncommon, and it's usually up here because that's where the gap is. Now I'm just pushing those bellows back into the body, putting my finger in underneath that said bush up here so that I can undo that screw, lifting that out. The shroud should lift out. We've got one screw here, holds the bracket that keeps our transfer shaft in. My video camera is busy shouting at me that the battery is tired. That was the bush that had fallen out of this hole in here. Our camera body is looking pretty stripped down now. There's nothing left in there but the back catch. Here is the shroud mechanism holding the buttons in from the top. Push that through, catch them with thumb and finger as it comes out the other side so that the buttons don't spring across the room and lose your springs. Recover the springs. There are the buttons. Here is the sleeve assembly from the shutter release. Here is the shroud stripped down and covered in nasty sticky grease. Here we have the finger for the shutter release. The shutter release arm acts on here, and this piece in turn acts on the shutter. Let's have this apart. There's a return spring here on a screw. Two screws here. One's got a larger diameter head than the other in this case. The large diameter head screw is at the top position. Just looking at this finger, make sure no one's been in there twisting it up with pairs of pliers, which is not uncommon for people to do naughty things like that when they're trying to get the synchronisation of the shutter release and the film advance correct. Or if a camera's been dropped on its head, this can even be bent. It is bent. Okay, so I'll have to straighten that up. That's not at 90 degrees. Well, we know this had a hard life because it lost a screw from there. Okay, so that is all stripped down now, and those pieces can go off and be pushed through the ultrasonic cleaner, I think.